Bienvenido a Alimentalk, el podcast que discute los avances científicos y tecnológicos para una alimentación sostenible.
Guten Morgen, Renske. Guten Mittag for you, I think.
Guten Morgen, buenos días.
It's a big pleasure to have you in Alimentalk today. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you. For the audience, Renske is an expert in the topic of proteins. As you all know, this is a very relevant subject nowadays, where people are looking for different alternatives to meat and dairy. However, I think it's better to hear from her about the background and her expertise. Before to give you the word, Renske, I want to thank all the people who is in this live today. I invite you to leave questions or comments for Renske in the comment section. I will make them in due time, so feel free to make them in either in Spanish, in English, so just go ahead. Renske, so let's start by speaking a little bit about yourself, your background in the field of protein. And again, thank you for being here, for agreeing to have this conversation.
Yes, thank you. It's very nice to be here. I'm Renske Janssen. I work at NIZO as a project manager on protein technology. NIZO is a company which does contract research for food companies. And I've been working now for quite a while on plant proteins and alternative proteins. And besides working at NIZO, I also am professor at the Applied Haas University, a lecturer in protein transition. I have a background in food technology, and I worked during my PhD on insect proteins. And now I'm mainly focusing on plant proteins and a lot of alternative proteins, ranging from protein extraction, but also product development, upscaling of products, but also on protein extraction. So that's a little bit about me.
Wow, very impressive. Thank you, Renske. So, Renske, what is the issue in the domain of proteins from the sustainable point of view? Why is this trend being increasing all the time?
Yeah, what you see is that the world population is growing, and we also have an increasing prosperity. So people are buying more products, more proteins, but we also need to feed all the people. And in order to feed this whole world population, also in the coming years, and they predict that we even need like 70%, the numbers vary a little bit, by 2050, increase in protein. And we cannot sustain our current protein intake like this. So we need to find alternative and have a protein transition towards more sustainable plant-based foods or alternative foods.
Continue.
So if you're looking at now, for example, in the Netherlands, currently we are eating more animal proteins compared to plant-based proteins, and you would rather have this ratio like 50-50 or the other way around, more plant-based than animal proteins. So that is the change you need to make in the coming years.
So is considered that plant-based is more sustainable than animal production? I mean, in terms of carbon footprint and things like that?
Yes, in general, this is the case. What you do see is that of course, the proteins coming from the animals, they came from the feed, and that is actually the plant-based protein. So if you remove the animal from this equation, then you get a more sustainable food. However, you also need to take into account the amount of processing. If you have a very difficult, complex process which needs a lot of energy, then the sustainability of plant proteins becomes less. But I would say in general, plant-based proteins are much more sustainable compared to animal proteins.
Okay. And what happens with the nutrition point of view? Are they also enough amino acids?
Yes, I think in general, a lot of people eat already enough proteins or more than enough proteins, so they get all their nutrients inside. What you do need to be aware of is that amino acid profile. You need to make sure that you have your essential amino acid profile, amino acids in there. This is not always complete within one plant-based source, but by combining different sources, this can also help to complete this profile. A very nice example is that if you're only eating pulse proteins, then you have a lot of lysine, but you don't have a lot of sulfur containing amino acids. But if you combine this with grains, for example, they have proteins which are high in sulfur bindings, and then they may complement each other and make a full amino acid profile.
Okay, interesting. So it's good to have this into account in case you want to make that transition. So, but you mentioned that this protein transition, but what is exactly that, if you can define it, and what are the challenges involved in that transition?
Yeah, if you would look at the protein transition, this is actually the transition from animal-based proteins towards plant-based or alternative proteins. And there are a lot of challenges actually, because proteins from animals behave differently than from, for example, plant proteins. So you cannot just say, instead of taking milk proteins, I take a plant-based protein, a pea protein, and I just replace it and I get exactly the same. This is not the case. So there are different challenges there. First thing is, for example, the solubility of proteins. Milk proteins tend to be very soluble because they are present in milk. So of course they are already in a watery environment. Pea proteins, on the other hand, are in general a little bit less soluble. So if you want to replace them, you need to make sure that they have the same functional characteristics in the protein. Then another thing which is also important is the taste, of course. Many plant-based proteins, they have a taste, so they taste like pea and they taste like they have some off flavor compared to animal proteins, and that is something to take into account as well. So some might fit with other products as well, and you can also mask this a little bit, for example, or use some fermentation to decrease this off flavor. There are multiple examples how to do that, but that is still a challenge to remove the off flavor and to get a neutral tasting protein.
I can imagine also that from those challenges that people are used to a certain type of products when it comes to protein. So you're trying to mimic this type of products is very difficult because of the functionality of the protein that you are mentioning, right? That you try to make hamburger or sausages or cheese out of plant-based is a huge challenge in terms of technology, right?
Yes, indeed. So in general, animal proteins are highly functional. So they are used already for many years, and we also understand them very well. So, for example, if you want to make a mayonnaise, you use egg, which is very nice. If you want to make some cheeses, etc., then you use all the dairy proteins. But it's very difficult to directly replace them with a plant-based protein to get the same amount, the nutritional profile as well. So in some cases you can manage, and in some cases you should add less protein, for example, to get still a good product.
Okay, so we already have spoken about plant-based in general, but what are the alternative proteins that are in the pipeline of innovation worldwide? What are the technologies that are behind?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of different type of proteins. So first of all, you have, of course, the plant-based, and then you can think of the more conventional plant proteins, like soy protein has been there already for a long time, and there are a lot of products available. But also like pea proteins, you see a lot. But there are also a lot of other novel type of sources, and you see increasingly interest in other sources, like from proteins from leaves, like rubisco, but also other type of proteins. There's a lot of interest in insect proteins, but also you have cellular proteins, so growing microorganisms to produce proteins. Related to that, the precision fermentation, so microorganisms producing specific type of proteins. And last, you also have like cultured meat, which is also a relatively new topic.
Yeah, it's very new, and I think we have a lot of expectations on that. So let's keep a little bit in the plant-based proteins, and then we can move to speak a little bit of the others that you just mentioned. So basically, Renske, is plant-based protein a long-term solution to tackle the sustainable challenges derived from animal production? And why are they getting so much attention than the rest?
Yeah, I think they are one of the solutions. So I believe that there are multiple solutions, and if you see the different type of proteins, they all can help facilitate this protein transition. So plant-based proteins are of course already there. So we all know the proteins. They have been on the field, but they have also been fed to animals a lot. So in that sense, it's an easier transition than to those novel type of proteins. So we are very familiar with them. Okay. And they are in general more sustainable, as we discussed already before.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, and to move to the other type of protein that you were mentioning, what is happening in the domain of insect protein? I mean, there was hype on that. Is it still there? Even you did your research. You just mentioned you did your PhD in insect protein. What is happening at the moment, and are they being looked as a solution for people that are, I mean, still non-vegetarian or vegan population, and how consumers are responding to this type of proteins?
Yeah, I think nowadays there are two species which are also allowed in the European Union. So first, insect proteins were not allowed as food yet because they were considered as a novel food. So the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, last year gave the green light to two species, the mealworm and the crickets. So that will facilitate the growth of this industry, of course. What you see is that if you're looking at the consumer attitude to it, it's still sometimes complicated. Insects are how they look like. Some people have difficulties, and especially I think the general consumer still has a lot of problems, issues when they see the insects to eat them.
I do have that.
So that is still, I think, an issue. What might help is if you process them into a product which is where they are not visible as an insect. Then you make it easier for people to accept. But that still remains more of a challenge, especially if you compare it to, for example, plant proteins that you need to convince the consumer to eat them, and they are less familiar because they are not used to it. At least in the Western world, they're not used to eat the insects in a regular basis. So that makes it more complicated.
Yeah. But it's possible to extract the protein out of the insect in order to make products that are more familiar to the consumer?
Yeah, it is possible to extract the proteins, or at least part of the proteins, and you can process them into different products. I've seen it in the market. They have already some burgers type of meat patties from insect proteins.
But still, this is, of course, no vegan. It's not vegetarian product, right?
No, in general, it's not. Of course, it's not vegetarian or vegan because insects are animals. But it depends if vegetarians want to eat insects. It depends on the reasoning why they are vegetarian. If you look at a sustainability point of view, then people might consider it. If they really don't want to eat anything from an animal, then they probably don't eat it. And that is a personal choice.
Yeah. And what about the taste? Is this insect-based products also have off flavors, or maybe the color? Are there any issues on that?
Yes, if you grind insects, they turn quite brown. And this is a kind of a similar reaction if you let an apple, if you cut an apple and you let it stand for a while, then it turns brown. And the similar type of reaction also happens when you grind insects. And that is something which you need to avoid, preferably. The taste depends a little bit, but in general, it tastes a little bit, like a nutty, crispy. that's a little bit of the taste. So it doesn't have a very strong off flavor.
Okay, interesting. So let's move to the cultivated proteins. Well, is this the same as cultured meat or cultured dairy? Are they considered a long-term solution? Can you elaborate on those type of proteins?
Yeah, I think cultured proteins are actually the cultured meat that you produce from animal cells. You produce the animal cells, but you don't grow a whole animal. So you, in a bioreactor, you grow your cells, and thereby, in the end, making meat type of texture out of it. It's still in its infant shoes. You see that there's a lot of movement around, a lot of startup working on this, and I think already, I guess it's almost already 10 years ago. The first burger was made in Maastricht from cultured meat, but you see that the world is moving fast. I think the main issue is still also the price. So you can produce some of those cells, but it's still quite expensive. And you need to, in the end, you want to have a product which is produced in a sustainable way. And for this, nowadays, you still need a lot of antibiotics, but also a lot of vitamins, amino acid, and those type of things to grow the cells well. So it still needs to have some big steps to be, I think, an alternative for the general consumer.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, this is like the synonym of cell-based cellular agriculture, because there are different terms on this type of products, right?
Yes, and I think you also, next to the cultured meat, you have like cellular proteins. So you can look at it in two ways. So you can grow microorganisms to really produce protein. They produce a lot of different proteins, and you take the whole cell and you get all the proteins out which are in there. The other way is precision fermentation. In this, you change the microorganism in such a way that they are going to produce a specific proteins. And this can be, for example, also dairy proteins. So a specific making alpha log or beta log or something specifically, and then use this protein as an alternative.
Well, Renske, what I see is that we have a lot of questions from the audience, and it's more related to this topic. So I will start to ask all the questions. So David is saying, well, David in Spanish, can you please dig a bit further into the advantage and disadvantage with microorganism-based proteins?
Yeah, I think the advantage is if you're using microorganisms to grow, they grow very efficiently, and you don't need a lot of land. So you can get a lot more proteins per amount of land. You can also use a lot of side streams as feed, so for the microorganisms to grow. So in that sense, you can valorize side streams from the food industry, for example, and that might be an advantage to use cellular proteins.
And disadvantage?
Disadvantage is that you also need to, there's still development needed to really extract the proteins and to use them into final products. So it is possible, but I think the scale up and making sure that everything is safe and produced in a consistent way, that is something which I think a lot of research is going on nowadays and will come in the future.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, we have another question from Edna Liliana. What is happening in the regulatory aspect of these new proteins technologies? Are they approved? I mean, you just mentioned insects. Are 2 species are approved?
Yeah, two specific species, but the others are not approved yet. I know there are still some in the process of getting approved. So with the EFSA, a lot of those proteins are in the novel food regulation. And in this way, they need to make sure that everything is food safe, that all the safety precautions are taken, and that they can actually prove that it's safe to eat. So some of them are already allowed and some of them are still in the process, I would say.
Okay. Well, we have another David. He's asking, what is the general opinion, regulation, status, opportunities for microbiological bacteria, yeast, algae, protein, especially in GMO-based proteins for food industry? This is one question. I think you already mentioned some of the answers. You want to say something about yeast and algae?
Yeah, I think there specifically on the microbial proteins, some of them are already allowed and some of them might not be allowed depending on the type of process. For example, the Impossible Burger, for example, is made also with proteins which are GMO modified. So those type of things are allowed, and some of them still need approval.
What is the reason there is this difference? I mean, is the type of microgreens or what?
I think it's also the type of process. It's maybe the specific type of process when it's allowed and when it's not allowed. So you can genetically modify them in different ways, and some of them will be allowed, and some will need some more regulation or checking.
Okay. Well, and his second question is, although we can in theory genetically design tailor-made proteins in terms in functionality, solubility, and other features, what is the advantage and challenges in the production of other ingredients crucial for palatability, such as fats, organic acids, and so on?
Yeah, I think in general, if I understand the question correctly, you can produce specific proteins, but in the end, there's a lot of things which are combined, making also the functional properties. So if you you produce a protein, this will not necessarily be exactly the same as what you already would extract from a milk protein, for example. So there are still challenges because it can be that with extraction you also change some characteristics of those proteins. So I think a lot of work is going on nowadays also to see what are the differences and what is still similar. Regarding taste, of course, not only proteins have a taste, but also all the ingredients and components around this. So if you do a protein extraction from a microorganism, it might be that you extract some other components like organic acids or so, which in the end also provide a taste to the protein. So that is also something to consider.
Okay. Well, I am very happy to see that you are getting a lot of questions. So be happy too that the people are really, really having a lot of inquiries about this. So Ricardo is asking about algae-based proteins because he heard or read that this is the future of the humanity for feeding humanity. So Dr. Janssen, please explain a little bit more about this. I think we already have this in our script, so just go ahead, Renske.
Yeah, I think microalgae can be another alternative protein source. So the advantage of algae is that they grow on carbon dioxide. So they get carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen instead of producing carbon dioxide, which is done in some other fermentations. What you produce is some proteins which are a lot of rubisco, and rubisco we know that this can be a very interesting protein with good functional properties. To get everything out in a cost-effective way, I think that is still the main challenge. But you see nowadays that they have already some products which have whole algae in the products.
What type? I mean, what species?
I think that is either spirulina is often used, but that is also partly used as a coloring agent. It is nice blue color. Often, if it's a natural blue color, then it's usually from spirulina. But also some, I think, chlorella species are sometimes used for that.
Chlorella also, right?
Yeah, chlorella.
You mentioned something about color because I know spirulina is used also as a color ingredient. How do you manage this color when you're trying to produce an actual food? I mean,
Yeah, I
how
think that
can you
is.
get rid of it?
Yeah, in some cases you need. That is definitely something to consider. If you're looking at algae proteins, you need to make sure that you don't end up with a green protein, especially if you want to make some dairy alternative or so. You want to have, in the end, it's always preferred to have a light colored, preferably white protein. But a lot of proteins they are either a little bit yellowish, they are more brownish, or they are more greenish. Sometimes they are also more grayish, and I think it also depends on what is your final application. In some products, it might not be an issue if it's a little bit yellowish, and even maybe preferred if you make a dairy alternative, then it looks a little bit more. If you make an emulsion, then it's not so much of an issue. If it's like grayish, then it's often not preferred because in general people don't like gray foods because it looks more like burnt.
Yeah,
So that is
exactly.
definitely something which you need to take into account into the process.
Maybe by the combination of different sources, and maybe you can get a balance on that. Is that
Yeah,
an
that could
option?
be, but yeah,
Yeah, but
it could
still in
be that.
development.
Yeah, if you use a lighter color or a darker color, and some you can also, if you make something which also contains fat with small emulsion droplets, you also change the color a bit. So you might also change a little bit of the color of your final product if you make an emulsion, and then you don't see this off color anymore. But it's definitely a challenge which you need to take into account as well.
Yeah. Well, we have another question, but I think I will leave it for the following question, because Camille is asking about cost. But I think it's better that you maybe speak a little bit more about fermented proteins, and then after finishing all the technologies, we can speak a little bit of cost. So, what are fermented proteins, and are they available in the market?
Yeah, I think there are not so many yet available on a commercial scale. You see that there's a lot of work going on. You have some products which are already, well, I think close to the market or on a small scale. If you're looking at just fermented proteins, and I'm thinking more of the specific fermentation, precision fermentation, and there are a lot of companies working on this to produce specific proteins, and this is actually done in a similar way as you would with GMO alteration of the microorganisms, as they also did to produce insulin, those type of things before. So it's done in a similar way, but then for specific proteins.
Yeah. But based on that, in this, I mean, fermentation as technology is also used to improve plant-based products, right?
Yes, yeah, you can
And
also look at it from fermentation from another way. So it's making use of fermentation to improve products, and then you can start from like a plant-based ingredient. So, for example, if you have a pea protein which tastes very beany, if you use some specific fermentation, what we have seen before is that you can alter this. The flavor profile and making a less beany flavor in the end. So in that way, you can already improve your ingredient and make a final product out of it. What you can also do if you have an ingredient which still tastes beany and you're making a product, a fermentative product, so for example, a yogurt or a cream cheese or so, you also use fermentation. And if you use fermentation in a specific way, you can also enhance the taste of this product, but also change the characteristics, like how thick the yogurt is or how viscous it is. So the fermentation can help in multiple ways.
definitely, I see. Well, and it's also technology that we are all are very familiar. So it's more we are more close to that. So it's easier to accept that, right?
Yeah, it's in that sense also considered as a natural solution to change, yeah, um, the taste of an ingredient, for example. So I think it's a very promising way to use this technology to improve plant-based ingredients.
Okay, and it does help also in the nutrition value. I mean, to improve a little bit that, or not.
I think in general, fermentation can also help to increase, for example, digestibility. But I'm not completely sure whether this is, well, this is not always the case.
Yeah, I can imagine it has to be case by case, right?
Yeah.
We have to see it. Now, so Camilo is asking, how costly are these protein technologies comparing to the standard proteins technologies?
I think nowadays they're still quite expensive, and especially if you consider, if you compare it in the Netherlands, the dairy proteins are relatively cheap. So in general, you have some of the plant-based which are in the same range with the animal proteins, but I think all the other different type of proteins are much more expensive still. This will change over time, because I think in general animal proteins will get more expensive if you also take into account the sustainability price of this, and the other proteins will also get more cheaper because they can produce on a larger scale, and they can in that sense also decrease the price. But nowadays they are still more expensive compared to animal proteins in general.
Yeah. Okay, well, David is having a comment that some commonly used algae in foods are spirulina, chlorella, uroglena, tetraselmis, dunaliella.
Yeah,
well.
Hematococcus as well. Yes, no,
yes.
I completely agree. There are multiple species which are used and which are produced. Some of them are actually spirulina is not always considered as a microalgae, and you have some of the saltwater algae and some of the sweetwater algae.
Yeah. So, well, one of the questions I had for you, it was about air protein, because it sounds like really strange to everyone. So you mentioned in one of our conversation that was also fermented protein. But I think it would be nice if you elaborate a little bit on how how can be this possible to make protein out of air, and what is happening in this field.
Yeah, so in general, if you want to produce microorganisms, what you have is, if you have in your medium where you grow your microorganisms, you need to have a carbon source, you need to have nitrogen in there to make sure that they can grow. And of course, minerals, vitamins, and those type of things. But if you're looking at air proteins, those are microorganisms which can use carbon dioxide, CO2, instead of another carbon source, which is usually in the solution, and you can think of sugar, which is always a good carbon source. So instead of making use of a sugar, they make use of CO2 from the air, so they can bind the CO2 and convert this into oxygen. And in this way, they can grow actually on air. So that is also an advantage, that they don't need to have all the other ingredients, and they can actually bind the carbon dioxide from the air.
That sounds like sci-fi.
Well, it's getting there.
Yeah, I know, but it's very interesting. But I mean, I would say that can have a democratization of food. So because I mean, you are not paying a lot for biomass, and you can have a very standard process, and then you get the protein. Isn't it like that?
Yeah, I think it's not so easy to make sure that you have this process. It still has some challenges, I would say, but it is possible, and you see also a lot of different companies working on this.
Yeah.
So it will come.
Yeah. I think this is a lot of challenges that we will have. Yeah, in terms of food technology and different also science fields to get there, right? Well, how do you see, or how do you predict that the consumer is going to accept all these proteins?
I think a lot of this depends also on the communication, how it's communicated. It is important to inform the consumer and to make them understand how it's produced, why it's produced in this way. And safety is, I think, the key word on that. So you need to make sure before you release anything that all those type of proteins should be safe. And that is the most important thing. And I think for the other things, it's very important to have good, clear communication on what are those proteins, how it's produced, why it's produced in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, I think we are reaching the end of this talk. I don't know if you want to have a last comment for the audience, Renske.
Yeah, I think overall we can say that there's not one solution in this protein transition. I think all of the different type of ways can help this transition, and there's also not one protein to fit all of the different applications. So we need to have multiple type of proteins, and in the end, what we need is a safe protein which is functional and which tastes good, and is also affordable to the consumer. So I think those are the most important things to consider if you want to bring this protein transition further.
Yeah, a very important remark. Thank you. Well, Renske, on behalf of the Food Engineering Program of Uniagraria and ACTA, we really would like to thank you for being with us today and clarify this important topic. I think there is still a lot to do and a lot to research, and I think you have given us like gaps for the scientists to continue with the work. So it's a very big contribution. Thank you. So today we have spoken about the diversity of alternatives that science is producing in order to tackle the future of scarcity of quality food for a growing population. That is a very big important topic that we have to face from the sustainable world. So we are still facing gaps. We need more science, we need more studies, and we need to really give consumers very important information and relevant information to make the right decisions in terms of protein choices. So Renske, if people want to contact you, so how can they get you?
I guess they can just reach me by email. Just send me a message.
Okay, your email is. I can write it down in the comments. So is that okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I will do it at the end of the talk, and also by LinkedIn. I think is possible.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Renske. It was a pleasure to have you today. Really, it's always nice to talk to you, and I really appreciate that you took this time to share with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, and I think all of you today that you were very curious and you make a lot of questions. Thank you for that. I think it's very nice to have these very interactive talks. And well, I invite you to the next episode that is coming on March 17th. And I also invite you to follow the podcast in Spotify. And now we are also in Apple Podcasts. You are all invited. Thank you very much, all of you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.